Hey there, and welcome to the Plays the Thing, Podcast 1, Introduction to the Series, and What is a Play? My name is Andy Black, and I'm a playwright. This podcast series is being offered in conjunction with the Play Submission Helper website. My personal playwright's website is www.andrewblackplaywright.com, and the Play Submission Helper website is www.playsubmissionhelper.com. This podcast is the first in a series on some of the key elements of playwriting. Each podcast, and right now we have 12 in the series, will have a brief handout that goes with it, which will make it easier for you to follow along with the content. And you may want to download these handouts prior to listening to the podcast. And I actually have one of the handouts in front of me. I'm using it as my guideline or my talking points for what I'm going to be talking about today. So if you want to take a break and go to the Submission Helper website and download the handout, you can certainly do that. This podcast series is designed for playwrights at any level. Beginners should get some great ideas about how to structure a narrative for use in a play, a theatrical experience. And more experienced playwrights will also pick up some very helpful tips. So, and I'm going to say that even if you're not a playwright, if you're just an audience member, if you're a member of the larger theater community, if you're an actor or a director, having a better understanding of the narrative of a play will make you a better actor, it'll make you a better director, and it'll make you a better audience member. If you don't like something, you're going to be able to explain better why it is you don't like it than you would have been able to explain it before. So we hope that there's going to be a wide audience for these podcasts, but I will say the primary focus is for playwrights. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to say a word about the learning aids. There's a series of handouts, and there's going to be one for each learning topic. And this handout is the one that I have in front of me as the handout for this particular podcast. These handouts will list key points on the topic, and they should make it easier for you to follow along with the podcast, particularly if you're a visual learner and you like to be able to see something that helps illuminate the key topics. So if you're a visual learner, you may find this handout to be helpful. You may want to download and print out the handout, particularly if you're going to be listening to the podcast in a situation or in a location, which allows you to follow along with some simple notes. The podcast will still be useful without the handout. So if you can't print it out, don't worry about it or flip out or get all stressed about it. But I will be making occasional references to specific page numbers in the podcast so that people who have the handout in front of them can follow along. And if you do have that handout by now, I'm actually on page 2. So you can follow along with some of what I'm saying on page 2. Let me see, I'm going to adjust the camera here a bit. There we go. So let's see here. Where was I? Oh, context. So what I've talked about is the welcome. We're glad to have you. We talked about the audience who this podcast is for, and a little bit about the learning aids that might make it easier for you to follow along. Now I'm going to give you kind of an overview of the content of the whole series, so you get a sense of the scope of what we're going to cover, at least in the first 12 podcasts. So the focus is on the structural elements of playwriting. And as a preview, the first 12 podcasts in this particular series are going to cover the following kinds of content. So podcast 1, what is a play, which is what I'm going to be covering today. I'm going to look at how theater is different from other art forms. And there are actually some implications for the playwright when you think about theater as an art form. It's unique in its own way. I'm going to talk a little bit about what kinds of theatrical narratives are going to benefit the most from this series, which leads into the key defining characteristics of a play, which make it different from other art forms which tell a story. Plays tell stories, but a lot of different art forms tell stories as well. All of these storytelling art forms have a narrative, but there are some things that are unique and specific to plays. And for the purposes of this podcast, I'm going to be talking about plays in a specific way. And today I'm going to define what that is so that we're all on the same, if you'll excuse the expression, all on the same page with that. Podcast 2, generating an idea. So what are some common sources of inspiration for plays? And there's actually some pitfalls of the different sources of inspiration you might use. And then once you get an idea for a play, how do you develop it? And then how do you actually come up with a theme so that you as a playwright know what you're writing about and what the theme or the key idea of your play is? Because that'll be important for you to understand as you develop your work. In podcast 3, I'm actually going to present 7 key elements of narrative, which are the backbone of the structural approach to writing a play. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why are these structural elements worth knowing about? What are they? There are 7 of them. How does a playwright use all 7, or maybe not use them, to develop a story? And if you have a story that you feel isn't going to lend itself to some of these elements of narrative, then what do? We'll talk about that as well. So that brings us up to podcast 4, which of course is the first structural element of the play, and that's the protagonist. So I'm going to answer the question, why is this important? Why do you need to identify a protagonist? And what are some of the key characteristics of protagonists? What are the characteristics of a really effective protagonist? And then what are some common mistakes that playwrights make when they're developing a protagonist? And then what can you do about them? So when you're developing your central character, the hero of your play, you don't end up making a mistake that you have to go back later and correct. That will bring us to podcast 5, which has to do with the major dramatic question of a play. And the contention that I have is that every play needs to have a major dramatic question that drives it. And I'll define what is that major dramatic question, or what is sometimes called the MDQ. And why is it important? What are some typical goals that a protagonist might have which would drive and create a major dramatic question? What's the difference between a conceptual goal that the protagonist might have and the tangible or on-stage goal? Because they're not always the same thing. In fact, it's better usually if they're not the same thing, for reasons I'll talk about. How do you turn a goal into an on-stage manifestation? And then how do the conceptual goal and the on-stage manifestation work together in narrative, particularly, of course, in a play? So that'll be podcast number 5. That brings us up to podcast number 6, where I'm going to talk about something called Old World Order and New World Order. So first, of course, in the podcast, I'll define what they are and talk a little bit about why they could be important for a playwright and why a playwright would want to know about them. And then that will actually lead us to the structure of what I'm going to call the first 10 minutes of a play. How do you think about and structure the opening of your play, which usually reveals the old world order? How do you set up old world order and new world order? How do they work to reinforce and reveal your theme? And then there's a little something at the end of the play about tying everything up, tying up what I would call your storylines. So in podcast number 6, I'm going to talk a little bit about how your storylines get wrapped up in the new world order. Podcast 7 is going to look at a theatrical term called the inciting incident. And I'm also going to do a special topic on supporting characters, the characters that support the protagonist in his journey or her journey. So I'll talk about what's an inciting incident. Again, why is it important? Why do you need to know about it as a playwright? What are some examples? I'm going to talk about letting the audience see the inciting incident, why that's useful to make a conscious choice about. How do you connect? There's a lot of things we've talked about up till now, and I'm going to try to connect them all in podcast 7. The inciting incident, the old world order, the major dramatic question of the protagonist, how do they all work together? And then we'll talk a little bit, as I said, about secondary characters and how they function in the structural mode. Podcast 8 was going to look at what I think we could call the plot or the story. There's a few other terms that are used to define that, the rising action complications. And I'll answer questions like, what's a simple plot line? How does a playwright create one? What are negotiations in a theatrical experience in a play? And why are they important? And then how do playwrights create and use subtext, which is a key idea that playwrights need to understand clearly in order to be able to develop their complications and their plot. That will bring us up to podcast 9, and I jokingly call this one going from bad to worse. Crisis, climax, and resolution. Now, the terms that I'm using here have different meanings to different people. Basically, what I will do in podcast 9 is define those terms as we're going to use them in the podcast series. So what's a crisis? Why is it important? The final decision of the protagonist and why the protagonist should be the one to make the final decision. And then how the consequences of the decision relate to the theme. And it's in this part of the play that the major dramatic question that you established much earlier gets answered. So I'll talk a little about how the crisis, the climax, the resolution, and the answer to the major dramatic question all come together at the end of the play. So by the time you've illuminated and brought all those different structural elements to life, the play should be done, at least in a first draft format. So in podcast 10, I'm going to talk about rewriting. How do you rewrite your first draft? Because it's an inevitable part of playwriting, is you're going to have to rewrite your play. So what are types of readings that you might do to get a better understanding of what you have, and then different types of rewrites that accompany them. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the first 10 pages and how you might want to treat that as a special category of rewrite. We'll talk about feedback, getting feedback. How do you get it? How do you use it? When you have a reading of your play, which is a really important way of understanding it better, what do you look for as a playwright? And then writing groups. I'm going to introduce that topic here. I think writing groups can be really important to playwrights for a variety of different reasons. So I'm going to talk about leveraging writing groups as part of the process of deciding what you need to rewrite. And then how do you approach your rewrite? How does that work? How does that all fit together? So then that will bring us to podcast 11. Further development and getting the work out there. When you finally get to the point where you think you're ready to send it out and let somebody see it who might be interested in actually producing it for you, how do you get the work out there? So there's more about writers groups and classes and networking. I'm going to talk about, I've called it writers groups and classes part 2. You have to find a theatrical community. I think that's a really important part of a playwright's job. How do you do that? And then sending your work out and submittal packages. How do you find them? How do you do that? Of course, the Playwright Play Submission Helper website could be an important part of that. We'll talk about that in podcast 11. And then finally, podcast 12, I'm going to talk about collaborating with others. Because theater is practically, by definition, a collaborative art form. So how do you find collaborators? How much you actually write with somebody else, if you have a writing partner? And then how do you work with other people to get the play produced? What are some of the advantages and potential disadvantages of collaboration? And then what are some best practices for working with others? So that's an overview of the 12 podcasts. So I'm just going to say one more thing before I get into some of the topics for today. I just want to say a little bit about myself, Andrew Black. So here I am, Andy Black, the playwright. And this is all included in your handout. I'll just give a kind of the flavor of it, is that I wrote my first play, which is a romantic comedy, with a collaborator. So I do have a lot of experience with collaboration. My wonderful collaborator is named Patricia Milton, and we wrote our play Porn Yesterday in 2001. It was a very simple romantic comedy. It wasn't anything particularly earth-shattering or original. I will say that it's very entertaining. It's a lot of fun. It has a great message, but it was a romantic comedy. So we were the finalists in a national playwriting contest in 2002, and we got produced for the first time in 2003 in San Diego. And that simple little romantic comedy has now been produced all across the country. And my collaborator, Patricia Milton, and I collaborated on 3 more plays, and then I began to write plays on my own. I eventually went to Ohio and got an MFA in playwriting. I graduated from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio in 2012, and then I moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, which is where I live now. And I teach at a nonprofit education center for writers called the Indiana Writers Center. I teach playwriting here. And my plays have been produced throughout the United States. I've had a lot of fun things happen recently. I had 4 plays in production at the same time here in Indianapolis last fall, which was great. In my other life, when I'm not a playwright, I'm a business consultant, and I have a degree in industrial and organizational psychology. And one of the things that I have done as a consultant is I've created a lot of learning programs and training experiences for adults. So I feel that the combination of my business background and my artistic talent qualify me in kind of a unique way to teach playwriting. with all due respect, there are a lot of great playwrights that don't know how to teach anything. And then there are a lot of great teachers that don't know anything about playwriting. So, and there may be a very small set of people who know about both, and I'm in that set. So, and if you want more information about me and my background as a playwright, again, you can go to my website, www.andrewblackplaywright.com. So if you've been following along in the handout, we're now on page 4, in which I have like a list of topics for the rest of the podcast. And I'm just going to quickly look at my clock and say we have about a half an hour left in our time together today. So what I've done again is I've given you an overview of the podcast series, and I've introduced you to the handout, so you know what that's all about. I gave you a kind of a preview of the topics, and I've introduced myself and talked a little bit about Play Submissions Helper. So what I'm going to be talking about over the rest of the half hour in this podcast is theater as a unique art form. What is unique about theater as an art form, and then what are going to be some of the implications for you as a playwright? And then what are some of the defining characteristics of what I'm going to call the well-made play? And what types of narrative, that kind of has implications for the types of narratives that are the most likely to benefit from the podcast series. So as I began to think about, I'm in the process of writing a book about playwriting. And as I was thinking about that book, one of the things that I thought about was, well, I need to define what a play is. And this is partly my instructional design background showing up. You know, I need to be able to say, well, this is a play and this isn't a play. You know, if you're going to write a play, this is what you do. And if it's not a play, then you don't have to worry about it. And as I reviewed the literature, I couldn't find any. There's lots of different kinds of performance art, and there's different kinds of public performances, you know, and there's lots of theater things that happen in theaters. But if you're going to do that, take that universe of performance art and boil it down and say, what is really a play? I couldn't find anybody that seems to have really done that. Now, I may yet come across that taxonomy, but in the meantime, I've come up with my own. So I'm going to start with that for today. And then, you know, if you don't like it, you can let me know. Send me sign onto my website and send me an email and tell me about your problems you have with my taxonomy and how you would do it differently. And then one of the features of the podcast is going to be, I'm going to give you some assignments. And the assignments are included in your handout. So I'm going to explain them in the podcast. And if you want to look at them on your own to apply the concepts from the podcast yourself, you're going to be able to do that. And then that will hopefully stimulate your own thinking as a writer and lead to you having your own insights about the concepts that I'm talking about today. So that is how we're going to spend the rest of our time here in this podcast. So how is theater unique as an art form? And again, for those of you that have the handout, I'm now on page 5. And there are 5 key characteristics that distinguish theater from other art forms for the purposes of our conversation today. And I have taught theater appreciation. And I taught theater appreciation at Ivy Tech, which is a community college here in Indianapolis. And I used a textbook. And one of and most of the students, I will say this, that I taught were not very sophisticated. They were not theater majors. They were general studies majors, and they had to take humanities requirements, and so they took theater. So they really didn't know very much about it. And one of the chapters in the book distinguished between how is a movie different from the theater. And I think it had the assumption that those was the primary frame of reference that a student would bring to a theater appreciation class is going to a movie theater and seeing a movie. And that it would be helpful for them to kind of distinguish that. I have to say that even though I had studied playwriting at the graduate level, I never really thought about that question before. How is a play experience of seeing a play live in a theater really different than a movie? And I found the content in the textbook really, really provocative. So I've worked with it, and I've kind of massaged it a little bit and given it my own spin. And so what I've come up with are 5 characteristics that I think are really interesting. So the first characteristic about a play that makes it different than a lot of other art forms is that it unfolds in real time in front of a live audience, right? So there is a live audience in the experience. And typically you're sitting there with people, some people may know very well, some people you don't know very well. So it's a community experience. You're not sitting in your basement in front of your big screen TV watching something by yourself, or maybe with your dog or your partner. You are in a public setting usually, and you're actually there with sort of an intention to be there, an interest in whatever the topic is. It wouldn't be. There are a few people I think have probably been dragged to the theater against their will, but most people are there because they want to be. So the spectacle of the play unfolds in real time in front of you, and you and the actors on the stage are kind of in the same place at the same time, exchanging energy with each other. So depending on how metaphysical you want to be about this, it's actually really kind of a magical experience that you're there in the same room at the same time, really experiencing each other's energy in a very tangible way. And since I began to think about this, and I'm going to encourage you as theater goers to begin to think about it more intentionally, the way that I have begun to think about it more intentionally. Since I have begun to think about this, one thing that I've realized is you actually get to see actors experience real emotion in front of you in real time. And there's something very, 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 very powerful about that. And as it just so happens, last night I was at a play where a woman felt betrayed by a man that she was falling in love with. He took an action that she had asked him not to take, and he felt that he had a very good reason for doing it. And he read something that she had written that she had asked him not to read, was the plot element. And so he was explaining to her why he had read this thing, and then telling her what he thought of it, and how much he liked it, and how much it meant to him, and how meaningful it was to him. And I was in the front row, as it just so happened. We got there a little late. I probably wouldn't have sat in the front row otherwise, but I was. And as he explained to her how much the piece that she wrote meant to him, the actress on the stage got tears in her eyes. I mean, it was quite obvious that she was about to cry. And I was so struck by the power of seeing this real woman, this flesh and blood woman standing in front of me, experiencing that emotion. It was so compelling to me. And as I reflect on it, and reflected on it last night and in preparation for this podcast, I was thinking how infrequently we actually see real emotion. There's a handful of places in life where it's really okay to let your emotions out. If you're with an intimate friend or your partner or family member, they may let their emotions out with you. They may not. It depends on the kind of intimate relationships you have. If you're in like a therapy group or a therapeutic situation, you may experience that. If you're like a therapy group or sometimes I lead workshops for a living. Sometimes workshops can become very personal, and people can reveal their emotion or talk about things in an emotional way. But it's rare. It's the exception. And there's something really, really, really humbling, actually, about being in the company of someone who is expressing real emotion in an impactful way. And that's what happens in the theater. And we as an audience get to experience the experience of other people having real emotions in front of us. It's quite compelling. Now, the first idea then relates to the second, is that there's a feedback loop between the audience and the actor. And this doesn't happen in a movie. But what happens in the theater is that the actor will respond to the audience's response. So if the actor says something funny and the audience laughs, it has an impact on the actor's performance. It gives the actor energy. The actor has to wait for the laugh to end before he or she can go on to the next line, right? And one time I saw a play. It was a musical in New York. And it was a very, very, very funny song in the musical, and it involved the singers having to sing and speak the words really, really, really quickly. And as the song progressed, the gimmick of the song was that they sang it faster and faster and faster. It was really, really, really funny and really delightful. And at the end of the piece, the audience applauded. And as the applause began to subside and the actors began to wind up to go on with the next bit of stage business, the audience decided they didn't want to let the actors go, and they started clapping harder again, and the actors then had to sit back and wait. So there was this whole kind of call and response between the audience and the actors as the actors were waiting for the audience to stop applauding madly so that they could continue with the play. And there's something about that exchange of energy, that feedback with the audience and the actors that makes theater really, 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 really special and meaningful. That's another thing that is unique about theater as an art form. The third thing that's unique about theater as an art form is that what we see happening in front of us as an audience member is something that we know will never happen again in exactly the same way. You can go see the same play the next night, but it's not going to be the same play. It'll be different. The audience is different. The actors are going to be different. The interpretation is going to be different. They may not even say the lines in exactly the same way that they did the night before. And there's something about this almost gets metaphysical, where there's something about that experience of liveness and uniqueness that increases the stakes for the audience, because we know this is our one chance to have this experience and it's not going to be repeated. And that's really kind of magical in a way. And then the fourth principle of how theater is unique as an art form is actually related to the third principle. Anything can happen in the theater because it is a live art form, and the bugs haven't all been worked out. So because it's live and happening in front of us, the actors may forget their lines and then have to cover, which is something that I've seen more than I care to talk about. A prop may be missing on the stage and the actors have to cover for it. The actor may trip and slip as it crosses the stage, right? So in a movie, if that were to happen, they would just simply reshoot the scene until they got it right. And because the experience of the play is something that will never be repeated, you can't just stop and say, let's go back and do that over again. You have to continue on. So there is something very special, again, about being able to see this level. There's a level of vulnerability associated with performing in the theater that doesn't exist anywhere else. And the fifth thing that's really unique about the theater is that it's a collaborative art form in a way that, now I'm going to say that all art forms are fundamentally collaborative in their own way. We're a collaborative species, so even whatever we do artistically, there's potentially going to be a level of collaboration associated with it. But in the theater, you can't do theater by yourself. There's lighting, and there's music, and there's stagecraft, and there's acting, and there's writing, and there's directing, right? So in general, most plays benefit from the collaborative talents of many, 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 many individuals. And I'm fond of saying that if you're a painter, you can go into your studio and get out your palette and your paints, and you can paint to your heart's content until the picture is done. And then when it's done, you can say, okay, it's done now. You can go out and show it to your friends, and there it is. You really don't have that luxury in the theater. If you're a playwright, you have to get a bunch of actors together and read it out loud to experience the power of your art form. So theater is a truly collaborative art. So those are the things that make theater unique as an art form. And I'm just going to go ahead and give you some assignments now to test. And you're going to have to go to a play in order to test these. So I'm going to ask you to see if you can notice the impact it has on you when an actor experiences real emotion in front of you. If this is particularly helpful in a small theater with real talent, like I had the benefit of being able to experience that last night, notice that when the actors are experiencing real emotion, the impact it has on you, and I'm going to bet you notice something. Number two, I'm going to ask you to notice that interchange between actor and audience member. And my question here in the handout, actually on page 5 of the handout now. Can you recall a time when the reaction of the audience had an impact on the performance of the play, and what was it? And it may be a small reaction or it may be a large one, but see if you can notice how that interaction takes place. Number 3, I'm going to ask if you've ever had the experience of watching something in a theater that you knew was totally unique to that performance, something that would probably never happen again. What effect did that have on you? I can still remember when I had the good fortune to see the producers on Broadway with the original Broadway cast of Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick. And I knew somebody who knew somebody, which is how we were able to get tickets. So that wasn't a big theater. Most theaters in New York are actually not that big. And it was so popular. It was so hard to get tickets. And we had the experience in that theater of like, it was like being the privileged few who were going to get to see that particular live performance of that play. And the air of expectation, excitement, and anticipation was just terrific, because we knew we were going to see something that very few people were going to get to see. And what we were going to see that evening was never going to happen again. So I'm going to ask you to notice for that kind of thing, or perhaps to reflect back on a time that's happened to you. I'm going to ask you to notice, either recall or notice a time when you saw a play and something didn't go the way that it was supposed to go, and what happened, how the actors covered or recovered, and then what impact does that have on you as an audience member when you notice that. And then finally, question number 5, and again, I've moved over to page 6 in the handout. Notice the collaborative nature of theater during a performance. The actors with each other, the actors with the crew, the tech personnel. It was so interesting last night at this play I saw where how the set changes were done so smartly and so quickly and so efficiently by a stage crew. And the performance would not have been able to proceed if it hadn't been for the precision and the talent of the stage crew and stage management team that made that happen. And then how does that affect your experience of the play collaboration? So now I'm going to move to page 7. I have 12 minutes left. So I'm going to zip through this. What I have is 5 defining characteristics of the well-made play. And the principles in the rest of the podcast are going to apply the best to the type of play that I'm going to describe here in just a moment. Now, I'm going to say in art, they were actually rarely firmly drawn lines. So the principles are actually going to apply to many types of narrative. And you can probably always find an exception to the principles that I'm going to lay out, but I think this might be helpful. And so the distinctions that I'm going to make in this podcast are defined as a continuum with 3 broad categories. This is definitely a play. This could be a play, and this is probably not a play. So one thing about a play, it's definitely a play if it's based on text, the written word. So it's a play that has a script and is primarily based on written words or language, right? That's a play, definitely. Now, it could be a play if it has text and music. It's like musicals. I think most people would agree that they're plays. They have text and they have music. So it could go either way on some of those. There are some where you almost think maybe not. It's mainly about the music, and it has a little bit of talk. That might be a concert, it might not be a play. It's probably not a play if it's based on some other form other than the narrative spoken word. So if it's a ballet, if it's dance, if it's a circus, if it's a cabaret show, if it's a music concert, it's live performance, and it could have elements of narrative in it. Cirque du Soleil has elements of narrative, but it's really not a play, right? An opera, is sort of in that gray area where a lot of opera is really all about the music. It's not about the story at all. So you've got text-based as one key element of the well-made play. Number 2, it's definitely a play if it has a unified story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the story is typically revealed primarily through dialogue and character actions. So it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, it could be a play if it's like short plays that are held together by a frame story or a common theme. So there's a play called Almost Maine, for instance. which is not really a unified story with a beginning and a middle and an end. It's a series of stories that all take place in the same fictional town in Maine. So short plays held together with a common theme. It's basically a play. It's probably not a play if it's like a collection of things. So like a review, a variety show, Saturday Night Live skits, vaudeville, magic show, light show, stand-up comedy. These are not plays, probably not plays. Now, again, you can sometimes use the principles of narrative in some of these probably nots, but a typical play, and the kind of play that I'm going to be talking about mostly is a unified story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if I haven't given you the page reference, I'm now on page 7 of your handout. So a play is definitely written to be performed in front of a live audience. And this relates to everything that I talked about a few minutes ago, where I talked about how theater is a unique art form. It has to be performed in front of a live audience for that to happen. But it was written that way. It was written to be performed in front of a live audience. It could potentially be a play if it was taken from another source, like a short story or poetry, and then rewritten to be performed live in front of an audience, right? So reader's theater might fall into this category where you're actually reading a story and kind of acting it out as you go, right? So it could be a play if it's been reconceived from its original format for theatrical production. I'm going to say that it's probably not a play if it's just taken from another source and then performed live in front of an audience with no changes. And typically poetry falls into this category. And a poetry reading is not a play. And even if the poetry has a narrative structure, which uses some of the principles of effective playwriting, it is probably not a play if you just take poems out of a book, stand on a stage and read them. And I've actually seen a lot of poets who have really strong poetry and much of it narrative poetry, who want to take their poems and put them on a stage and call it a play. Now, it's theater, it's performative art, no question, but I would conjecture that for the purposes of our group learning together about playwriting, it's really not a play. Let's see here, what do I have? Taken from another source and performed live in front of an audience, no changes, I said that. Poetry or fiction readings. And then I'm going to put movie scripts in here because they're not, even though the principles of good narrative typically will apply to a movie script, they're not written to be performed live. They're written to be filmed and then shown in a movie theater. So that's, they're not a play. One thing about a play is it could potentially be a wide variety of lengths. So, what I have, it could be full length, which could be 90 minutes, 2 hours. Longer. It could be a one act, which could be like 60 minutes, 90 minutes with no intermission, or even 10 minutes could be a play, right? Because it could have all these other characteristics. It's text-based. It could be a unified story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it could be written to be performed in front of a live audience and only be 10 minutes long. Now, I'm going to say that it's probably not a one-pager. And more recently, I've come across the idea of the one-page play or the one-minute play. I'm not a fan. I'm not a believer. I think that in order to really develop the story, you need longer than a minute. Now, you can tell a complete story in a commercial on TV. There's no question that a story can be told. Whether it really classifies as a play is open to, I think it's a controversial one. And I would be on the side of the team saying it's not a real play. Finally, the last characteristic of what's definitely a play is its theatrical reality. It's fictional. It's illustrative. It's metaphoric, right? So there's a quality of imagination that imbues it. Now, plays that are, that could be plays that are based on true events. Definitely. And I've actually written plays myself that were inspired by true events. But I'm going to say only if the playwright is in a position to take artistic license with the content in the service of telling a good story is it a play. If the playwright is trying to recount the truth of events as they actually happened. That's reality. It's not a play, right? So again, for the purposes of our time together in this podcast series, if you really want to tell the true story about something that actually happened to you and you want to tell it the way that it really happened, that's great. But I'm going to say that's probably not a play. And I'm going to put into this category artistic storytelling, right? It could be a play. It might not be a play, kind of depending on the amount of license that's taken with it. What's probably not a play in this category of theatrical reality would be anything that's like actual reality. And what I'm calling like docu-theater, right? Found object theater. There's a school of theater, and the Laramie Project is an example of this, where nothing original is actually written for the piece. It's collected objects, it's interviews, it's almost journalistic in a way. That doesn't make it real. That doesn't mean it's not entertaining and it's not performative and it's not theatrical. But strictly speaking, it's not really a play, because the playwright's, the writer's ability to manipulate reality is limited by the fact that the primary objective of it is to eliminate real life events. And I also have memoir and fact-based storytelling. Now, again, there is a continuum here, right, depending on how far to one side or the other you go. But one of the things that I've seen is that people who want to write plays that are based on real life events back themselves into a theatrical and creative corner, because they feel that they cannot fool around with the facts of the experience in order to create an effective narrative. And so they're not able to really optimize the storytelling potential. They have to do the same thing 3 different times because it really happened 3 different times. And then a good storytelling, you would just do it once and then move on. So those are some of the characteristics that I'm defining as in the category of what is a play. And again, if you want to look on page 7 of the handout, there's a table in there that has all these different categories and is going to give you some more information. So last but not least, I'm going to give you your assignments for what is a play. And this might help if you use the table that I provided you in your handout. It's food for thought on what is a play. And it says here, using the table above, see if you can determine which of the experiences, theatrical experiences you've had, or you have to think of one or have a new one, which of those experiences fully meet the criteria definitely as a play. So you're going to really apply these criteria thoughtfully. And then you're going to look at performative or theatrical experiences which you may have had, which even though they were really satisfying, entertaining, and enjoyable, you can look back and go, strictly speaking, this wasn't a play. And one thing that I'm going to say, and I may revisit this idea in a later podcast, is one of the things that's happened with fringe theater is that there's the rise of the one-person show in fringe theater. And so there are, I think that roughly speaking, there's like 2 kinds of one-person shows. The one is a one-person show where the person wants to tell their own story. So somebody had a life-changing experience and they want to share about it, or somebody has had a really interesting and compelling life and they want to tell about their life story. And those kinds of theatrical experiences can be very entertaining. The stories may legitimately be really, really interesting and performed by actors or by performers who have incredible talent to capture the room and command people's energy, attention, and as they tell their story. But I'm going to say, strictly speaking, standing up on a stage and telling the story of your life is not a play, right? It's theater, it's performative, it's not a play. And then the other kind of fringe phenomenon is there's the one-person show which recounts the life experiences of a famous person. So the life of Benjamin Franklin, right? So somebody appears on stage as Benjamin Franklin, and he basically tells the story of Benjamin Franklin, probably dressed as Benjamin Franklin. And it's historically accurate, and it can be very interesting and very informative and stimulating and funny. And strictly speaking, it's not a play. So if you're working on those things, I would encourage you to listen to the rest of the podcast, because you might figure out how you can turn those things into a play and have a different kind of satisfying theatrical experience. And at the same time, there's something wrong with doing that. I think doing that kind of art is terrific. So, so you may, as you do your assignments, find a play or a theatrical experience that does not meet the criteria, and then you can have some fun with that. There's certainly nothing wrong with that as well. And then the final assignment is, I'm going to assume that you're listening to this podcast because you've either written a play or you want to write a play, or maybe both. And I'm going to ask you to think about your own idea, your future idea, or maybe a past idea. And then once again, go through the little table in your handout on page 7 and say, does it meet these criteria? Right? Is it one of these? Did I want to write a 1-minute play? And if so, maybe I need to make it longer. Or was I planning on taking poems that I wrote and just performing them in front of an audience? Well, maybe that's not a play, and maybe I want to do it a different way. So once you've decided where your idea falls into this matrix, then you may say to yourself, are there any adjustments that I want to make in the way I think about my work? And if there are, then of course I would encourage you to come back for the rest of the podcast and see what you might do with the play that you wrote. So this, from my perspective, this 45 minutes that we've spent together has flown by. I've actually gone a little over time. I hope that's okay with everybody. I am excited to share what I know about playwriting with other playwrights. Perhaps a couple of actors and directors are out there, maybe an audience member or two, to share what I know about playwriting and the structure of the plays, to provoke you, stimulate you, excite you, and get you on the road to either enjoying more theatrical experiences or maybe creating some of your own. So this concludes podcast number 1, The Play's the Thing, the introduction to the series and what is a play. And I look forward to having you all back for podcast number 2. And let me quickly look at my notes here and see what we're going to be talking about next. Generating the idea. So if you have an idea and you want to develop it further, that would be a good topic for you. And maybe you're a playwright who's trying to come up with a new idea. And that would certainly be a podcast to listen to if that's the case. So thanks, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you in the next podcast. This is Andrew Black, AndrewBlackPlaywright.com, signing out and saying goodbye for now.